The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The alleged worsening of income inequality has been one of the most heated topics of economic debate over the past decade. But discussing the problem of income inequality makes certain assumptions about our economy and society that are worth exploring. Can we take the existence of wealth and prosperity for granted? What is the process by which income is created, and should we expect income to ever be equally distributed? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss some of these questions that lie beneath the income inequality debate is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. G.P. Manish. Welcome back to the show, G.P.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
So we want to get into this question about the income inequality debate, but just to pose the entire question that way, make some assumptions about the existence of income and income that could be there to redistribute, and presume somehow that maybe income could be equally distributed. Now, all of this to evaluate all of this, we have to have some idea of how it is that we might see income be distributed in the economy overall. And this gets into a question that economists, you and I in our work talk about is a counterfactual. And counterfactuals are really important in how we think about economics. So if you could, let's just start by saying, what exactly do we mean by a counterfactual?
Well, counterfactual is another state of the world that could potentially exist. Right? So when we are talking about the question that you're raising here, we're really discussing we're trying to evaluate, in a sense, the existing state of the world as we see it, with the income distribution as it is, versus a state of the world where income would conceivably be distributed equally. Right? And then we're trying to see, okay, which of these states is better in certain senses that we would like to discuss as economists.
This counterfactual or alternative world that we're trying to evaluate doesn't actually exist, right? So we have to sort of imagine or create it.
Yes, and it exists in the mind of the analyst, right? And so all these policy discussions that we're hearing in this debate about how income should be distributed, and it's not just now. These questions have been debated over the last century at least, if not more. And all of them involve sort of posing or analyzing the current state of the world versus a sort of state of the world that in the analyst's mind exists, and which he or she is trying to argue we should or should not make into reality.
And these states of the world that don't exist but that are so relevant in both evaluating policy and guiding our own thinking about just how we think the world might or should work, we need to make sure that these alternative states of the world are sort of well constructed, and that's sort of, in one sense, the task of economic theory, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in a sense, I mean, everybody's discussions on any policy questions are guided by counterfactuals. So it's the job of the economist, really. It's not like we talk about these things in a way that's different from a non-economist. It's just that our job is supposed to be to analyze these with more rigor and more precision. And with respect to the whole question that we're talking about today, the way economists or certain economists have discussed this issue is to sort of de-link or to completely divorce this alternate state of the world, right, from the production of wealth. So in other words, when we talk about this counterfactual as saying, oh, income should be distributed in this way, the way they usually go about analyzing it is to assume that this thing called income just appears, right? So it's like this income is there, it's there today, and it'll be there in this alternate state of the world. And what we really have to discuss or talk about is how do we distribute it, right? Which sort of leaves out, a core question, which is how is this income actually generated?
Right, and it almost assumes that, it assumes that there's income out there to be redistributed, but if we think about it across the broad span of human history, it's actually been poverty that's been far more the typical human condition than lots of income available for redistribution, right?
Absolutely, and that's sort of an ironic aspect of this whole discussion, which is that a lot of people who are arguing for changing the distribution of income and focusing on that seem to forget the fact that through most of human history, like you said, I mean, a lot of humanity was similar to the picture on the left and not the picture on the right. And in fact, even today, if you go to many parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, etc., you will see almost like sort of a throwback to how Europe was, say, before the Industrial Revolution. People still live those kind of lives.
And so I guess an alternative way to think about that then is to say, well, how is it that we ever have income created so that we're not all in poverty?
Absolutely. And so I think a far more productive way of thinking about the whole issue is first and foremost to ask ourselves, how is income produced, right? Or in other words, to link income to production, and then discuss questions of inequality, rather than just talking about just this possible state of the world where income would be distributed differently, which seems almost to assume as if that redistribution will not affect how income is generated in the first place.
So that's the other part of this whole effects of phrasing the question or phrasing the issue as we're phrasing it. We're assuming that it could possibly be plausible to imagine a world in which income was being generated and generated equally across people in society.
Right. Yes, that counterfactual first and foremost assumes that it's possible to generate income and to do so in a way that is equal across individuals, which of course, if we analyze even very not so in depth, would seem quite difficult to imagine. And the other sort of aspect of it is that process will not interfere with the actual amount of income that we have. So not only does it assume that everybody will produce this income and do so in a way that we can somehow have an equal distribution, but also that the amount of income or the wealth we see today will also appear in that future or that counterfactual state of the world.
So we have to have income and wealth and our modern prosperity get produced by the efforts of individuals.
Yep.
And certainly a part of the effort, or certainly some of the production activity of individuals are going to depend on some inherent skills that people have. Some people have some skills, like say LeBron James.
Yes.
He has some certain skills, and those skills are going to make the individual, say for instance, with the skills sufficient to play in the National Basketball Association, they're going to make those people millionaires. Right? So that's a part of the question here. Is we have to look at the distribution of skills across the economy. Right?
Absolutely, we have to look at the distribution of skills. Also, we have to look at the development of skills, and that's what economists usually call human capital, right?
Okay.
So LeBron James' skills of being able to play basketball that he has developed over the course of his career or his through his effort, etc., we call human capital.
Okay.
But of course, we also have to talk about physical capital, machines, tools, how those things are distributed across different individuals, which are of course owned through saving. So all of these different sort of means of production, we must think about how they're distributed, right? And how they're utilized. To think about how is it that we can then talk about income, the earning of income, and how it's unequal or equal in a market economy.
So to begin with, if skills are important, or if skills and our inherent attributes are a part of what makes us productive, and those aren't distributed equally, that sort of gets at this whole question of, could we imagine income being distributed equally?
Right. In the sense without redistribution.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So I mean, just that's why I said even if we think about it, even very in a very brief way, you can imagine that, for example, I'm not going to ever be able to sing the opera, like Pavarotti, Pavarotti's passed away, but any of the great opera singers of today, and their skills are valued in a way that they earn much more than I would. And so there are obviously certain aspects of all our skills where we sort of are limited, right? And there are certain amounts of income in a given state of the world that we cannot attain because of those limitations.
But as you mentioned, there's a lot of investment in human investment, both in physical and human capital that's going on here. And so it's not just, I mean, LeBron James would be an example of somebody you think might just be relying on their God-given talents.
Right.
But they clearly have to work very hard. There's lots of people, at some level, maybe at age 12, have some basketball potential. They have to work very hard to get actually and succeed in the NBA.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think anybody who follows sports, coaches and analysts will always talk about somebody who's, he's so talented, but he could never really realize that talent because he didn't have the discipline, or he didn't have the ability to put in the hours, etc. So, I mean, skills are not just, of course, there is a limitation in terms of innate skills. LeBron James is obviously endowed with, certain skills that others are not endowed with, but that does not therefore mean that he just does not actually put in effort and work in order to make that marketable in a way that he earns his millions.
And then we have the other forms of investment, other forms of human capital investment, like in this case here, it's a student studying for med school while they're in med school. And so whether it's going to school to get a PhD or get a college degree or go to medical school or law school, become a rocket scientist. So there are all these different forms of human capital that people are investing in. It takes time and effort.
Absolutely, and it takes sacrifice.
Hard work, yeah.
Sacrifice also of the present in order to get more in the future. So, in your slide here, on the left, you have a student who is, obviously sacrificing a lot of consumption in the present. I mean, what he's doing is obviously not giving him a lot of satisfaction. It's painful work. But on the other hand, he's doing it because he's going to attain a greater income in the future. But on the right-hand side, you might have, say, maybe his sibling or somebody else who's sort of partying away on the beach, and he's consuming a lot today, but sacrificing possible greater consumption in the future.
And when it comes to investment in capital goods, the savings that are necessary to build factories, that involves sacrifice too.
Absolutely. Right? I mean, those who own a larger proportion of capital goods obviously are sacrificing in the present and choosing not to spend those goods on, say, flashy cars or whatever it might be that they would like to spend it on, and instead are investing in various ways, either directly starting their own businesses or investing in the stock market, or different avenues and vehicles for investing in companies. And
it's also risky too. I mean, you could save and invest, help fund to start a business, and the business might not succeed at all.
Yes, and in fact, not just physical, of course, investment in physical capital, but also investment in human capital is risky. I mean, when you go to school, whatever debt you might take on, or all the time and effort you put into it, and your own funds, if you wish, or your parents' funds you put into it, you assume that you will get a higher rate of earnings, right? Return, you'll get some return on your investment through higher earnings. Well, that might or might not happen in the future. That's an uncertain event.
And so we would see, with this, we could see a very unequal distribution of income. But that's not necessarily indicating any real problem, because with this example here, we could imagine the case of two siblings about equally talented, and we both have the high enough IQ that they could go to med school if they want to. Right. They take very different paths in life, which in one sense is good, because people should have the freedom to pursue what they want to pursue in life, and if that involves surfing and enjoying life on the beach instead of going to medical school, I mean, it's important that people have economic freedom. But then you could also get a case when when the one sibling graduates from medical school and maybe becomes a top flight surgeon. Right. They're going to have a significant income inequality, right? Right,
absolutely. And this is guided, of course, by every individual's life choices, and the choices you make at a given point of time have implications in the future. But also the other aspect, and I know we're going to touch on this later in the course of our conversation, is that on the market, all of these higher incomes are earned through a reward for your contributions to consumers, right?
And I mean, we had the example of LeBron James earlier, but professors like you and I also benefit in some ways from the existing division of labor that we have in our society. That before 100 years ago, before we had the rise of the National Basketball Association, LeBron James couldn't have made millions because there wasn't a market for him to sell his very specialized
services,
but tremendously skilled talents. And you and I couldn't be making a good living, in other places and times giving lectures on economics, right? So
right.
We're in some ways we're very lucky or fortunate to live in a prosperous economy where we have this division of labor, but we're still contributing too, aren't we?
Right. I mean, take the case of somebody who inherits a lot of wealth, or now obviously he could fritter it away, or he could use it productively, right? Just the same way LeBron James is born into a world where you have these opportunities, but that does not mean that he somehow magically becomes an NBA star. He still has to work and make those sacrifices in order to get to where he's at, in order to be able to attain his income. In just the same way that a professor is born with certain skills potentially that could be realized in this world, which would not have been realized in earlier worlds, but he too has to put in the effort and make the sacrifices in order to become productive and contribute to the greater good of society. And earn his income.
So there could be some luck in some sense. There's certainly benefits. We don't create the world that we're born into.
Of course. Yes.
But on the other hand, we still do have to work and contribute. And if we all weren't making that contribution, we wouldn't have the world that we're living in today.
Right. I mean, how many great novels have been written about this, right? You have somebody who has a big inherited income, but then who fritters it away and finds himself, poor, while the other guy who works, who starts off at a very different point in life, far more unfavorable, but works and works and works and lands up in a far more favorable situation.
Now, when it comes to actually measuring inequality, the Census Bureau puts out a lot of statistics that people use, and the main way they use is to look at income. But income, we end up is measured usually annually, and that's somewhat a deceptive measure of well-being over one's lifetime, isn't it?
Absolutely, simply because it can fluctuate so much. So, for example, the individual here, he's unfortunately unemployed, but I'm assuming his income is probably cratered, and he, for that year or for that period, he might be in the lower, end of the income distribution. But once he gets a job, he might jump back up. And the same way, with respect to all the examples we discussed, when you're making those sacrifices, when you're a med student, when LeBron was giving up other opportunities in order to be able to focus on his basketball, they probably, you were on the lower end of the income distribution, but once your effort starts paying off, you jump up. Right, so over your lifetime or even a shorter period of time, you can be in different positions with respect to the income distribution.
And if you start a business and you work for many years to try to get that to succeed, and then you're able to sell that business, maybe it's successful and somebody's going to buy you out, you get a big windfall in that year. And in that year, you might be up in the very top 1% of the income distribution, but you're not up there every year.
Right, and in all those, when you start a business or when you did start this business, you were probably on a very different part of the income distribution, sacrificing a lot in order to be able to put in the capital into your startup. So
for that reason, some economists argue that we should probably look at other things other than just income due to its annual, its measurement on this very short annual time horizon, which doesn't necessarily measure. So what would be an alternative way to try to measure how people are doing in life and how much inequality there is?
Well, we could look at something like consumption, or really what you can do with the income that you earn, right? And look at that. And really, the point you're touching on is that because of these fluctuations in income over a period of time or over one's own lifetime, that's therefore, just because at any given point in time there is income inequality, that does not reflect therefore some sort of great loss of welfare in terms of consumption, but also that people can ride up and down this income distribution through mobility, right? And so when we often say the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, what we forget is that in a dynamic market economy, the rich are not the same people, the poor are not the same people.
Meaning the rich, when the census measures income this year, are not the same people who were rich, like say 5 years ago.
Right, and there's a lot of churning there, largely because of some of the things we've been discussing.
But consumption tends to be more even over time, right?
Right, and also that ultimately that's what we really care about, right? As economists, I mean, everything we discuss with respect to different institutional arrangements is with respect to standards of living, what goods you can consume, what goods you can't consume, and so maybe looking at that can give us a better idea or a different focal point of this whole discussion to center this whole discussion around.
So when we do look at consumption, what do we find?
Well, one of the things we find, especially in economies that are market economies, for example, like the U.S., but also in cases like India and China recently, who have liberalized a lot, we find sustained improvements in the amounts of consumer goods that people all across the income distribution can attain. And I think these graphs sort of indicate that.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what's going on with these graphs here.
Well, what you find is that if you look at, compare 2006 to 1971 for the entire population or even the poor, which I assume is the lowest 20% of the population, you see a huge increase in the average, in the percentage of households who own, say, a washing machine, or a dishwasher, or a microwave, or a color TV. So in other words, while the income inequality between 1971 and 2006, as measured in just terms of income, might be increasing, what you find, however, when you look at consumption, is that there's been, overall growth in the actual availability of goods for, all people in all different aspects of the distribution, but also the poor.
So I guess there's two things that are emerging from something like this. One is that, things are getting better, at least in terms of the measuring the availability of these consumer items. Because as we can see, whether it be for all households or the poor, as we get on in time, a higher percentage of these households have these things.
Right.
But then we also see that the poor households are catching up. They are improving in life. They have greater access to consumption goods now than they did before. And in some ways, they're catching up.
Yes, and this is in fact a unique aspect of inequality in a market economy, because essentially, when we talk about incomes and incomes being earned, and what is rewarded is really what economists call your marginal productivity, but which really means your contribution to the satisfaction of wants of consumers. I mean, so for example, the reason why LeBron James earns more than most other people, but also other basketball players, is that because people come to watch LeBron James, right? So you take LeBron James out of the team that he's in, the revenues of that team is going to fall far more than somebody else, because people value watching LeBron and what he brings to the game. Right. So most of our differences in earnings of incomes are reflective of this aspect of how we can satisfy consumer preferences. And therefore, in a market economy, when you see sustained increase or sustained inequalities of income, or however increases, decreases across time, they nevertheless go hand in hand with improvements in the actual goods and services produced for the average consumer. And in that sense, this is very different from, say, what existed pre the 18th century, when or what we call in a feudal sort of system, where you had the lord and you had the serf, and the lords, generation after generation would continue to just be rich, while the serfs would be mired in poverty, largely because the income of the lords is coming from exploitation and not from serving, consumers.
So we in terms of the question that's related to the income distribution, we are seeing some increases in GDP in our society, but some people are arguing that the gains are mainly being captured by the 1%. But we do see some evidence, especially in consumption, that the gains have been pretty broadly experienced.
Yes, especially if you look at a longer time span. And I think the longer the time span you look at, the more amazed you are by, for example, the what somebody would call the common man, or the average, household in the U.S. today, or in fact most of the Western world today, has a higher standard of living than, say, most kings and queens did. Even 200 years ago. I mean, take simple things like just having soap to wash your hands, or having running water, hot water to be able to take a bath, or having cotton undergarments. Some of these things were the major causes of disease, in 250 years ago. But all of those have been eradicated, not because, because of the fact that the supply of these goods has been increased so much that the average person is able to consume enough to keep germs away.
Now, one of the areas where is to go beyond the inequality element of to say that there might be stagnation or that the average person or lower income individuals in the United States aren't doing so well today. It has been to look at the cost of things like medical care or college, and the fear that for the average household, going to college might become a dream because it simply becomes too expensive, or medical care is so costly that if prior to the Affordable Care Act, if you lost your job and you didn't have medical care and you got sick, you couldn't possibly afford it, and then you couldn't afford health insurance afterwards. So, I mean, what would you say to these a couple of these cases of goods that appear seemingly to get so expensive that they might be affecting standards of living?
The biggest thing you see there is that these are the sectors where there's most amount of government involvement in the production and supply of these goods. While most of the goods we looked at earlier, they like these goods along with things like smartphones and laptops, etc. The prices have been falling because their production has largely been driven by private entrepreneurs, and so in a sense, this is sort of the situation here in the U.S., which is restricted to sectors like this, is the common situation in, say, highly regulated economies, such as even India of today, or as of today, and other economies where really the sectors are regulated so much that the costs of goods remain high, and so it remains out of the hands of most households.
So, as we come along here, so we've talked about some of the sources and this whole idea that somehow there's a big pot of income out there that sort of exists and is just waiting there to be redistributed as we want. Is at odds with sort of like a lot of economic realities and economic history and comparative economics as well. But I mean, what's sort of the problem is we hear cries or calls for income redistribution. What could end up being a big problem here for us?
Well, the big problem here is that in your effort or your zeal to sort of attain this goal, which is really in a sense an ethical goal of having an equal distribution of income, you destroy the institutional conditions that are essential for actually creating wealth in the long run.
So could you expand on that a little bit more here?
Well, for example, if one of the proposals is to slap a wealth tax, to tax extreme at much higher rates or very high rates those who earn high incomes or those who have a lot of wealth, that would destroy in many ways the capital markets, right? And that would destroy the ability of people or the incentive of people to save and invest. And therefore that will destroy future productivity for the average laborer, but also the availability of goods for the average consumer in the future.
So all that income has to be produced.
Right.
We do rely on a lot of incentives.
Right.
And we have to be very careful that we're not going to affect these incentives, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think crucial to this is to sort of distinguish between the good or welfare enhancing inequality that comes from market and market forces versus the inequality that is ossified and generated by interventions into the market. And really, if you look at economic history, especially over the last 200 years, it's market forces that have improved the lives and the plight of the common average person in terms of the goods available. And so you don't want to destroy those institutional prerequisites, right, in order to get to this place where this wealth is distributed in an even fashion.
So we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater in any way, shape, or form. And to make sure we don't do that, we have to be very careful. We remember that all that wealth has to be created before it can be redistributed.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the show, and thanks for the conversation. And thanks for joining us. And join us again next time for another EconVersations.